Ya kuwa rumande nchini Tanzania kwa zaidi ya miaka mitano unusu hivi bila kufunguliwa mashtaka, hatimaye Mkenya Don Bosco Gichana ameachiliwa huru.
Naitwa Don Bosco Gichana, tembo ya Kisii.
In 2007, at the peak of Kenya's election season, a brand new Hummer H3 appeared in the middle of Raila's political campaign. It wasn't bought by a politician. It wasn't funded by a party. It was a gift from a 26-year-old Kenyan man almost no one had ever heard of. His name was Don Bosco Gichana. And almost immediately, the country started asking questions. How does a young man that age afford a machine like that? Media outlets picked up the story. Some, like Miguna, even called it a show of power. Others couldn't even explain where the money had come from, because this wasn't normal wealth. This was something else. To the public, Don looked like a success story, a student who had gone to the United States and come back loaded. But behind that lifestyle was a financial operation that stretched across borders, involving stolen identities, insider bank deals, and forged U.S. Treasury checks worth billions. And for years, he moved untouched, until one decision changed everything. Welcome. This is Dark Hour Docs. To understand how Don Bosco got there, you have to go back to a time before the money and before the politics, to a teacher's home in Kisii. Don Bosco wasn't born into wealth. He was the son of a teacher, raised in an environment where education wasn't optional. It was everything. And early on, he showed promise. Smart, focused, disciplined. He was the kind of student educators talked about with pride. That brilliance earned him a spot at St. Mary's School, Yala, one of the country's top national schools. And from there, the path seemed clear. He only needed to work hard and success would follow in order for him to change his life. But somewhere along the way, that path began to shift. Don Bosco would later secure an opportunity many could only dream of, a move to the United States. He went there to study and build a future. So he decided to chase the so-called American dream by attending Brown University College. And at first, it looks like everything was going exactly as planned. New environment, new networks, new possibilities. But here, students were not just chasing degrees, but also fast money. He interacted with students who understood systems and finding ways to quietly manipulate them. One of the most common scams he learned involved what is known as business email compromise. This involved entire operations built around studying how companies communicate, identifying suppliers, contractors, and payment schedules, then stepping in just at the right moment and getting paid for goods they did not deliver. Emails would be crafted to look legitimate, sometimes identical to real correspondence, instructing companies to redirect payments to new bank accounts. By the time the mistake was discovered, the money had already been moved, split, and withdrawn. But even more sophisticated than that was the exploitation of identity systems. Some of these students had learned how to access or obtain personal information belonging to individuals who were no longer actively monitoring their records. These involved people who were deceased or incarcerated. Using these identities, they would file tax refund claims with the U.S. Treasury, presenting them as legitimate filings. On paper, everything checked out. The names were real, the details matched, and so the payments were approved. What followed was a steady flow of money, funds that appeared clean within the system, but were built entirely on deception. For a young man far from home, Don Bosco was surrounded by people who not only understood this world, these people were already benefiting from it, and the shift was gradual. What once felt wrong slowly started to feel like an opportunity for him. Before long, Don Bosco was no longer just observing from the outside. He had stepped into the system himself, learning how it worked. He refined the methods and eventually found his own place within the scam. While most students around him were struggling to keep up with expenses, he was beginning to generate income at a completely different level. The kind of money that doesn't just solve problems, but changes perspective. And with that shift came a dangerous realization. The conventional path of education, employment, and slow growth no longer felt appealing. Not when there was a faster route, one that seemed to reward precision, timing, and calculated risk. That was the moment everything changed. Because what had started as exposure had now become a system, and Don Bosco had just begun to understand how far it could take him. This was the moment Don Bosco made a critical shift. He was no longer content operating within the United States. Instead, he began exploring how the same methods could be applied back home in Kenya, where financial systems were structured differently and, in some cases, more vulnerable. By the time he returned, he was not just a student with ambition. He had developed a working understanding of how banking systems worked, identity fraud, and financial processes that all could be manipulated for gain. But he also understood the risks. Unlike in the US, where operations could be carried out remotely, any mistake in Kenya could lead to immediate exposure. Rather than rushing into fraud schemes, he took a more calculated approach. He built relationships, expanded his network, and positioned himself within influential circles. During the heated 2007 election period, he made a bold public move by gifting a brand new Hummer H3 to Raila Odinga. The gesture attracted national attention and raised serious questions about the source of his wealth. But it also elevated his status and brought him closer to political power. Behind the scenes, this visibility served a purpose. It created the impression of legitimacy while giving him access to networks that could prove useful if things went wrong. With this foundation in place, he executed his first major operation in Kenya. He targeted FinaBank, identifying a high-value transaction involving a Chinese construction firm. Through a combination of planning, persuasion, and alleged insider involvement, funds meant for the contractor were diverted into accounts linked to his network. Approximately 96 million shillings was moved in a transaction that initially raised no immediate alarm. Significant funds from the scam were used to invest heavily in sports, which saw him become a major sponsor of Shabana FC, a Kisii-based football club. The success of this operation reinforced a dangerous belief that the system could be manipulated with the right access and timing. At the same time, events in the United States were beginning to change the landscape. Authorities, including the United States Department of Justice, had started cracking down on tax fraud and identity theft rings. A July 2007 indictment exposed a network involving Kenyan nationals accused of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar tax fraud scheme, signaling that law enforcement pressure was intensifying. For individuals operating in that space, the message was clear: the U.S. had become high risk. In response, the Don and his associates adapted. Their shift in focus away from the U.S. led them to explore opportunities around, with their next phase of operations being in Tanzania. Here, new connections within the banking sector made larger transactions possible. Don's strategy this time was more ambitious. Forged U.S. Treasury checks were deposited into local banks and processed as legitimate funds, exploiting delays and weaknesses in verification systems. Large sums of money began moving through accounts, accumulating into amounts that ran into billions of Tanzanian shillings. For a period, the operation appeared successful. The transactions went through, the money flowed, and the network expanded. But schemes of that scale rarely remain hidden for long. As the amounts increased and international attention grew, scrutiny followed, and the window for operating undetected began to close. Because in financial crime of this magnitude, exposure is not a matter of if, but when. Every empire has its cracks. And for Don Bosco, those cracks began to show at a place he least expected: the border. By 2013, he had built a reputation that stretched across borders. He was wealthy, connected, and widely seen as untouchable. But the very networks that enabled his rise would also contribute to his downfall. His arrest came at the Namanga border, the crossing point between Kenya and Tanzania. He had traveled to visit an associate, Midian Wale, who was already in custody at Arusha Central Prison. Midian was a Tanzanian lawyer and advocate who had been implicated in a major long-running money laundering case alongside Don Bosco and was arrested in the early 2010s. What Don Bosco did not anticipate was that Tanzanian authorities were aware of his involvement. Upon arrival, he was detained without warning and taken into custody. This marked a dramatic shift. The man who had operated by defrauding international financial systems was now caught and confined within one. Legal proceedings in Tanzania revealed the scale of the case. Don Bosco and his co-accused faced 59 charges related to money laundering, conspiracy, forgery, and possession of unlawfully acquired property. The charges were tied to forged financial instruments, including U.S. Treasury checks that had been processed through regional banks. The amounts involved were significant. Investigations linked the network to transactions totaling approximately $4.9 million. It was a complex case involving multiple jurisdictions, financial institutions, and coordinated actors. So, the Don remained in detention for several years as the case progressed through the legal system. During this time, public interest in his story continued to grow, fueled by earlier displays of wealth and his association with political figures. Media coverage often highlighted the contrast between his previous lifestyle and his situation in custody. By September 2018, the case reached its conclusion. A court in Arusha handed down a sentence that included the option of serving more time in prison or paying a substantial fine of 15 million shillings. He chose to pay the fine, securing his release. However, political connections played a crucial role in facilitating negotiations and easing diplomatic pressure. He even publicly expressed gratitude to Raila Odinga, claiming that efforts had been made on his behalf, including engagement with former Tanzania President John Magufuli. His return to Kenya, though, after release, was very dramatic. Don came back like a king. He was escorted by choppers and seemed like he was living his best life while in prison. He appeared physically healthier and had gained weight during his time in custody, a contrast that added to the public intrigue surrounding his experience. He even threw a pompous welcome party where huge political figures like Oscar Sudi and Kalonzo attended. This sparked a public debate about the nature of his influence and support network. Despite the conviction and years spent in detention, his return signaled that his influence had not entirely diminished. Instead, it highlighted the complexity of his story. His journey reflects both ambition and risk, and a demonstration of how financial systems can be exploited. And so ends this chapter of Don Bosco, a tale of brilliance, audacity, and a fall that didn't quite break him. Some call him a fraudster, others a survivor. But one thing is certain, his story is unforgettable. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thanks for watching.